am so pleased that we have Justin Worland here from Time Magazine, where he is a senior correspondent. And he is also the recipient of the Climate Journalist of the Year Award in 2022 from Covering Climate Now. I'm really excited for his talk, and I'm really pleased that you guys are here. So here he is.
Thank you for the introduction and the invitation. I'm just going to adjust this slightly. Hopefully it stays. This is always a fun issue. So thank you again for the introduction, the invitation. My name is Justin Worland. I'm glad to be here in Texas. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I always appreciate the different conversations that I feel like are happening outside of D.C. and specifically in Texas. So I'm glad to be here. As Nora said, I write about climate. I write about energy and climate at Time. And I'm specifically excited to be at a conversation that's, an energy conversation at Energy Week. Oftentimes I feel like conversations around climate and energy exist in two parallels and two parallel universes. And one of the things I try to do in my work is to connect dots across those lines. And I'm particularly glad to be speaking at a conversation that's framed around energy. And I'll get into some of that later, but first I just thought I'd share a little bit about myself and how I came to this job. Really, it was totally by chance. About 9.5 years ago, I was writing about other things. I was writing about health. I was writing about a little bit about politics, general assignment reporting, and this job opened up writing about climate. And I really, I didn't know much about it, and I said to the editor, I don't have any background in this. How am I supposed to write about it? And he said, that's great. If you don't have any background, you're going to be writing for people who also don't have much background in it and will be better able to explain what's happening. So I jumped in, and pretty quickly I was taken by the beat. The more you dig into it, the more you start to realize how crucial energy and is to the world around us, how climate really is a part of everything, important to everything. And there's this framing that I often hear in energy reporting. It's a framing that probably you all in the audience have heard, maybe some of you use it. It goes something like this, everything you look around you, this water bottle, the pen, your shoes, are made from oil and gas or petrochemicals in some way. And the whole world, all of society is wrapped up in the industry. Now, people often, when they say that, are using that framing almost as a talking point. It's almost like a prebuttal because they see climate in my bio and want to explain to me, how important fossil fuels are. But it's true. Fundamentally, it's true, right? Energy, fossil fuels are critical to our society. Now, it's also true that climate change is increasingly shaping everything around us. Most obviously, it's driving warmer temperatures and extreme weather, but also contributing to migration, which has political implications, affecting crop yields, reshaping industries. And so what I see as a core part of my job, and what I think a core part of the job of an energy and climate journalist should be, is to think about how to connect all of these dots, to show how energy and climate are really integral to our society, how all of that is changing, and to do that day by day, story by story, et cetera. Crucially, as I alluded to earlier, I think it's also important to think about the ways in which energy and climate overlap, and to not allow those to be two parallel narratives that don't touch or only sort of touch. Sorry. And in doing so, the goal is to equip readers to be citizens, consumers, business leaders, et cetera, not with any particular advocacy goal in mind, but just the understanding that knowing about energy and climate is going to better equip them to do all these things that they do. So today I'm going to talk briefly about how I approach energy and climate coverage, and then get into some of the juicy debates on the debate about how to cover industry. And I know there's a panel that probably is going to touch on some of these themes after this. And I plan to leave plenty of time for discussion at the end. Sometimes I like to jump into things that I find interesting, and the things that people in the audience are most interested might be even more basic, like how do you pick what story to write? So I would love those questions if that's what's on your mind. So, like I said, I'll start just with my own approach. I see my job in some ways as a dot connector, explaining to readers accessibly as possible what's happening in the world around them with regard to climate and energy. At the core of that is sort of a mantra that I try to follow, which is you meet people where they are. In some ways, this is obvious. You use accessible language to the annoyance of many deep in the weeds of energy and climate. This sometimes means a trade-off between precision and accessibility. So, sometimes it means trying to explain things in language that people will understand, even though you're missing the sort of jargon or specificity that you might use in an energy or climate conversation between experts. I also look for characters to tell the stories, whether that's a community, a company, or an individual, things that are going to really bring the story to life. I'll give one example of how I've tried to push the boundary a little bit further and expand the narrative frame about how we talk about climate and energy with the newsletter I started at Time in 2019. It's called Climate is Everything, and each week we connect the dots between things happening in the news and climate. Sometimes those links are obvious, think of like a hurricane. Other times they're more complex. For example, digging into how climate and energy are shaping the relationship between the US and China, right? These are things that, something that's in the news, but that people might not exactly get that link intuitively. I think there's other ways you could think about this when you think about energy. Sometimes it's thinking about how energy news relates to people's lives. Gas prices is a thing that immediately connects with readers, and some of my best read stories have been about gas prices. But there's also, more complicated, but I think more interesting ways to think about connecting with readers. Some of that might be, finding the human stories in the Permian, and some are much bigger, thinking about how energy connects to geopolitics, or how its energy abundance is facilitating growth, or energy scarcity is hindering it. I would say that every story is different, and I don't necessarily think all of my stories match that frame. So if you go through my writer profile and find something that doesn't match what I'm saying, that's possible, but that's what the goal is, finding ways to meet readers where they are, in language they understand, and things that they're already thinking about, rather than trying to bring them into a conversation that might be a little hard for them to access. For me, another key part is connecting the dots between communities and conversations and narratives, things that are existing in sort of separate spheres. And as I said, I think this is really critical with energy and climate. An energy journalist who is really deeply embedded in the field in, say, oil and gas might talk to industry, might read various think tank reports or industry reports, and have one understanding of the world which is accurate but is very insular. At the same time, a climate journalist might talk to climate scientists and talk to NGOs and have a different understanding of the world. Again, one that's grounded in reality, but sort of in a parallel universe to the energy journalist. So for me, my approach is really to try to talk to people, across the spectrum, to travel to places and get to know people, to read the scientific literature, but also the 10Ks, to show up at industry conferences, but also to spend time with activists, and to try to connect those dots, in the time when I have to actually write between all that other stuff. No one gets a pass as a neutral narrator, but everyone has a chance to share their views. Now, as I alluded to in the beginning, there's a very important debate happening about how we cover these different stakeholders. Most obviously for this audience and for this conversation is, how do you cover industry? How do journalists cover industry, in this moment? Clearly, as I've said, I'm happy to talk to everyone. I think it's incredibly important to do so. But I think there are many journalists with a climate focus where there's a reflexive rejection of what industry has to say. And I think there's understandable reasons for that, right? Particularly, the energy industry, oil and gas in particular, hasn't been a reliable narrator for, in the past, in particular, for decades on the science of climate change. Excuse me. And I think there's a really lingering mistrust from that, right? And I say that not to shame anybody, but rather to say that to actually have a dialogue requires a rebuilding of trust. What I try to keep in mind, and this might be a second mantra that I follow in my reporting, is that two things can be true at once. And this is really crucial, I think, in this space for nuanced reporting. Probably true in other areas as well, but in energy and climate, I find it to be particularly true. Oil and gas, fossil fuels more broadly, are playing the key role in rising greenhouse gas emissions and in turn are hugely damaging for the climate. They are also, in the short and medium term, necessary for human flourishing. Oil and gas companies have a checkered past. Nonetheless, we have to engage with them to understand how they're spending trillions in capital, which is crucial to understanding the energy transition. Finding the way to thread that needle, I think, is difficult for many journalists. The conversation is polarized, and I think, to be frank, the messages on sort of both sides, so to speak, can fall into an either-or paradigm. And it's crucial for journalists to try to break out of that. Now, you might be thinking this is all nonsense and, there are a whole bunch of reasons you might think that, but I'll address one sort of response that I often get, which is that all sounds great, but I just don't see nuanced reporting reflected in the stories that I read. And, first I would say there are a lot of great journalists out there doing good work, and there's a lot of nuanced reporting that you have to look for. But the other point I would make, and this is just the thing, anytime I'm invited to speak, I have to make this point, which is to say, where do you get your news? How do you engage with news? Are you paying for it? It's journalism right now is in the middle of a sort of a massive upheaval. And one of the reasons, I think, why we see such polarized coverage is because that's what consumers engage with. And so I would encourage you, before jumping into a critique of the industry, to think about how you get your own news, what you pay for, do you pay for it? Try to encourage good behavior. To my mind, this is one of the biggest challenges for the future of energy and climate journalism. So as I said, I want to open up to discussion and questions. I'll just close again with the reminder about my two sort of mantras I mentioned. One is the meet people where we are mantra. That's an important role for journalists, but also for communicators broadly on energy and climate. I mean, I know oftentimes, in speaking to each other, we can jump in deep, but most people have no idea. It's striking to me how often you have to repeat just the basic facts in a story for people to understand. So meet people where they are. And the second is two things can be true at once. I think we need to wrestle with that in communication, journalists in particular, but broadly speaking. So would love to have some questions and some conversation.
Okay. Thanks, Justin. That was great. A question I have a lot is word choice, and I don't know if you write, so you must carefully choose your words as you're doing this. But as a director of Energy Institute, someone who talks to a lot of people about energy there just seem to be so many words that are frankly trigger words to people, all the way from energy transition, net zero, decarbonization, climate change itself. So do you care about that in your reporting? Do you think about it? How do you address it?
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, sort of my first thing I said was it's great to be here in Texas because I find it so interesting. It's a good reminder, phrases like energy transition, which, are widely used in Washington and some of the climate circles that I might drop in, sometimes provoke different responses here. My goal is usually to find the most neutral and precise way to convey what I'm trying to say. So if I think something is a trigger, that's a distraction from the point I'm trying to make, and I avoid using it. I think there is like a point where all of a sudden some phrases cross over from being distracting to just being, the lingo such that, you just got to use it because that's what's precise. I think energy transition is an interesting one. I mean, I wrote about this last week at CERAWeek. I remember the first time I went to CERAWeek, I don't know, 7 years ago or whatever, and energy transition was essentially a dirty word, a dirty phrase. And now it's no longer necessarily a dirty phrase. It's maybe means something different in Houston than it means in Washington, but people are using it as a sort of accepted phrase. And so, I'm trying to sort of not move the needle on language because I think that distracts. That's just sort of short answer.
There's a question over here.
Hi, Justin. Thank you so much. My question is, in a population that's feeling so much climate despair and a generation that sees a sense of futurelessness or inability to actually make the change that we all think needs to happen, what role do you see for journalism in exploring potential positive futures and solution pathways that can get this public engaged and desiring to see a positive future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and of course, there's been the rise of this, approach to solutions journalism, as it's called, where journalists really write about solutions and focus their stories on that. I think it's important to. I think that's an important endeavor. It's not necessarily my approach. I also think that there's really interesting. News and journalism is so often rooted in what's happening now and, trying to be timely, but really grappling with some of these questions requires thinking in, 20, 30-year timescales. And so I think it's a challenge, and I think there's some who've done it well to really, grapple with that and grapple with the positives, not just the negatives. The one thing I'll say is, particularly in longer stories where I have the space for it, I think it's really important to try to find ways, even if it's just a paragraph or two, to, offer a solution, because most challenges do have some solution, even if it's not a full solution, even if it's not politically feasible. You have to give readers a sense that there's something that can be done. And so I try to integrate that. And I think that's an important point because not everybody's going to become a solutions journalist, but at least they should consider what the solutions are.
Hey, thanks. So you brought up the concept of, or asking, where you're getting your news, how much you're paying for news, or are you paying for the news, which I think is important. It made me think about for a while there, we were all paying for cable. You were paying a certain amount. Now we don't pay for cable, but now we kind of actually do because we have Amazon Prime and Netflix and also, basically paying the same amount we were before. So how much should we be paying for news? Obviously we should all be subscribing to Time, right? But, but how much should a person who wants to be know what's going on, how many subscriptions should we have? How much should we expect to pay?
I wouldn't be so bold as to say, to try to come up with something precise there, other than subscribe to Time. But other than that, I don't know. I think the biggest thing I would say is actually, and I hear this all the time. Oh, yeah, I subscribe to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so I'm doing something. And it's like, well, actually, the New York Times, especially, they're fine. What really matters is, the Houston Chronicle, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, et cetera, your local news. And those are the ones that are hurting the most. Those are the ones that sometimes can unearth the stories in communities that actually move the needle. And so I guess I would say, if I had to allocate one subscription to everyone, I would say figure out what your local news outlet is and subscribe to them, because they do important work.
Hey, Justin, thanks for doing this. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship or a relationship between the correspondent and his or her editor, and if and how it's different in the energy and climate space relative to other beats that you've worked on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, everything, good editors make or break a reporter, right? I mean, that's definitely true. I mean, in any beat, editors are, people you go to for gut checks, for making your stories better. I think one of the challenges with energy and climate, I think particularly at general news outlets, is that there's not necessarily a deep bench of knowledge. And so oftentimes reporters are having to, explain why this matters, or explain why, the editor's thinking doesn't really work. And I think that's a huge challenge. I mean, it's like, I've been doing this, as I said, for, almost 10 years. There really aren't that many people. I mean, some of them are in the audience, but not that many people who've been thinking about these things for that long, and certainly not at smaller general news outlets. So that's a challenge.
Hey, Justin. I was curious how you approach subjects that sort of encapsulate the climate crisis, but may, appear as unsympathetic. In particular, I'm thinking of oil refinery disruptions in the wake of Harvey in Houston. How do you cover difficult subjects like that?
Can you just say one more when you say that may appear unsympathetic? What did you mean by that?
Maybe in the sense that, they are not the folks that we typically think of as the primary recipients of the negative effects of the climate crisis. But
right, I see what you're saying.
Also, those are families that, are experiencing job disruptions, things of that nature.
Right. Right. I mean, I think, I don't know if you're alluding to this in particular, but I do feel like there was some almost gloating type stories about, your refinery is damaged by climate change. And yeah, so, I mean, certainly that wouldn't be my approach. I guess I would start by saying that. I think it's important to try to meet people where they are emotionally, but I think it's also important to, to have by which I mean, I understand why people go to some sort of salacious approach, as I was alluding to, but I think, that's not really a humane way to tell that story, and that's not how I would approach it. I think, I do think it's an interesting story. I think it's an interesting, just as a business story, how do companies, not just in oil and gas, but broadly, protect assets? And yeah, I mean, I think it is important just to sort of spin off that a little bit to recognize that people who work in the industry are people too who are providing for families and not necessarily at the crux of some of the challenges. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but it's an interesting point. It's a good reminder, I think.
Hi, Justin. So my question is, obviously there's very polarized views about climate on both ends. And so I'm curious, what is kind of the mission of Time and you in that spectrum, and how does your decisions about what stories you choose to tell affected by that?
That's a great question. So, I think Time is maybe would probably describe its mission slightly differently than some other places, though I think the way that people think and write about climate change is changing. And by that I just mean, I'm not advocating for any policy or any particular approach to the energy transition, but I would say that clearly, the science shows that climate change is a huge problem that's going to threaten lives and livelihoods, et cetera. And so, when I say I hope to inform people so that they can, engage as citizens, as consumers, et cetera, there is a hope that they will make their own choices using that knowledge to do something positive for the world. And I think that's the way that Time would talk about it. They hope that our journalism inspires positive change, even if we're not advocating for any particular policy. And I think, to that point, I mean, story selection is hugely important. I mean, it's sort of at the core of that. I think, frankly, the biggest answer when people ask me, why haven't you covered this or that yet, it's because I don't have time, not because of anything else. But I think it is our responsibility to try to uplift stories that can help contribute to that sort of broader positive change.
All right, I have a question. So sort of on your mantra number one, meeting people where they are. Are people getting anywhere else? Or do you just have to write the same story over and over? You said your most popular stories are about gasoline prices. I think we've known about gasoline prices and pain at the pump at least since 1974. So would you make a commitment to never write an article about pain at the pump again? No, no, but are you able to speak at a higher level as we go? It's
a really interesting question and an important one. I think you kind of have to meet two demands at once, because the truth is, in some ways, no. In some ways, there's a large audience that isn't informed, and when you talk about a story about gas prices, which are really a lot of people are reading, it's not necessarily the same person. You might be reaching a different audience, and I think for a brand like Time, which is really broad, we want to continue to serve that audience. At the same time, my writing, I think, at times, in an ideal world, a story reaches both that audience and then has something interesting to say to, I don't know, people here or people who are more engaged in that discussion. And so, I'm trying constantly to find ways to thread that needle, to really say something new, to meet people where they are, which is different from where they were yesterday. But there's still a large audience that just doesn't understand this stuff or engage that deeply. And all this, the research on this, shows that people, if you asked a social scientist or a psychologist about how I should be writing, they'd say, write the same story 10 times because that's the only way that people are going to get it. And so there is an element of that, unfortunately.
Hey, Nora, can I take one last question? All
Go
right,
for it, Brian.
Justin, we have some budding journalism students here, and I also want to hear you answer this question. As a person who writes, and then you've got to do all this, go to these conferences, talk to these people, take these meetings and all that, how do you budget your time to be able to do what you need to do to write?
That's a really good question. I think with writing specifically, and this is, I don't know if this is the healthiest approach, but I often find that limiting myself is the best way, right? So it's like I do this weekly newsletter and I say I'm going to write it, it's due at whatever, 1 p.m. on Thursdays. Usually I get up in the morning on Thursdays at like 6 and say, that's all the time I have. I have until, I'm not gonna spend 5 days tinkering with it and thinking about it. It's really just being exacting and managing that time and not letting it seep into other things. That works for me. I know other people who say that would freak them out, that they wouldn't be able to finish it in time, but it works for me. I will say that is one of the, it is a challenge. It is a challenge, and I think you see a lot of people sort of experiment with different things that best match their own internal clock and their own family needs and whatever. So, I have colleagues who disappear at 2 p.m. and then they are writing between, 6 and midnight and whatever. It's people find different ways to make it work. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.